Obese mother of twins was traded for animal skins. What the caveman did next shocked everyone. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the weathered wooden cabin nestled between towering red rocks and scattered pine trees. Evangeline Whitmore pressed her face against the dusty window pane, her breath fogging the glass as she watched her husband Jeremiah haggle with the strange man who had emerged from the mountain caves like a phantom from the depths of hell itself. At 45, Evangeline carried the weight of hard frontier life in every curve of her body. The difficult twin pregnancy 8 years ago had left her heavier than she'd ever been, and the isolation of mountain living had done nothing to help her regain her former figure. Her once golden hair now hung in tired braids down her back, streaked with premature gray that spoke of worry and hardship endured in silence. The mirror had become her enemy years ago, reflecting back a woman she barely recognized, soft where she'd once been firm, tired where she'd once been vibrant, defeated where she'd once been hopeful. Mama, who's that scary man talking to Papa? 8-year-old Sarah tugged at her mother's worn calico dress, her identical twin brother Tommy peering around Evangeline's generous hip to get a better look at the strange visitor who'd appeared like a specter from the mountain wilderness. The man outside was a sight to behold, easily 6.5 feet tall, covered head to toe in animal pelts with wild hair and piercing blue eyes. He looked more beast than human, something from an ancient legend. Covered head to toe in various animal pelts, bear, wolf, elk, and others she couldn't identify. His long, dark hair wild and unkempt, he looked more beast than human. His massive frame towered over Jeremiah's slight build, and even from a distance there was something predatory about the way he moved. The locals called him the Mountain Man, or simply Cave Dweller, though few had ever seen him up close and lived to tell detailed tales. He lived somewhere high in the rocky peaks, emerging only occasionally to trade pelts and gold nuggets for supplies, appearing and disappearing like smoke on the wind. "Hush now, children," Evangeline whispered, though her own heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird desperate for freedom. Something about the way her husband's shoulders were hunched, the desperate gestures he was making, the way he kept glancing back at the cabin with what looked like guilt and fear, filled her with a dread so deep it seemed to settle in her bones. Jeremiah had been acting strangely for weeks, disappearing into town for days at a time, returning with bloodshot eyes and the smell of whiskey clinging to his clothes like a second skin. She'd tried to talk to him, to understand what was driving him to drink and gamble away their meager savings, but he'd only grown more secretive and hostile. Through the window she could see the mountain man pulling out a leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of gold coins. He pointed directly at the cabin, then at Jeremiah, then made a gesture that looked like he was pointing at her. The realization hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and making her legs weak beneath her. Evangeline's blood turned to ice water in her veins, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. "No," she breathed, stepping back from the window so quickly that she nearly knocked over the wooden chair behind her. No, he wouldn't. He couldn't. But even as she spoke the words, denial thick in her voice, she knew in her heart that Jeremiah was capable of exactly what she feared most. The gambling debts that had been mounting for months, the drinking that had grown progressively worse, the way he'd been looking at her lately, not with love or even familiarity, but with the cold calculation of a man weighing his options and finding them limited. She'd seen that look in merchants' eyes when they evaluated livestock at market, determining value and worth with clinical detachment. The cabin door creaked open with the groan of old wood, and both men stepped inside, bringing with them the smell of leather, wood smoke, and something wild and untamed. Up close, the mountain man was even more imposing, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill the doorway, and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see everything, assess everything, judge everything. Those eyes fixed on Evangeline with an intensity that made her want to hide behind her children, to become invisible, to disappear entirely from this nightmare that was unfolding before her. "Evangeline," Jeremiah's voice cracked slightly and she could smell the whiskey on his breath even from across the room. "This here's Marcus. He's made us an offer." "What kind of offer?" she managed to ask, though her throat felt constricted. and the words came out as barely more than a whisper. She was afraid she already knew the answer, afraid of what her husband had done, afraid of what this moment would mean for her children's future. The mountain man, Marcus, spoke for the first time, his voice surprisingly cultured despite his wild appearance, carrying the cadence of education and refinement that seemed completely at odds with his primitive exterior. "Mrs. Whitmore, your husband owes some very dangerous men a considerable amount of money. Men who will not hesitate to harm your family if that debt isn't paid within the week." Tommy and Sarah pressed closer to their mother's sides, sensing the tension in the room, even if they didn't understand the adult implications of what was being discussed. Their small hands clutched at her skirts, and she could feel them trembling with fear and confusion. "I don't see what that has to do with," Evangeline began, but her voice faltered as the full implication of the situation began to dawn on her. "I can pay his debts," Marcus interrupted gently, his tone surprisingly kind despite the harsh reality of his words. "In exchange, you come with me. You'll be safe, fed, protected. Your children will be provided for." The words hit Evangeline like physical blows, each one landing with devastating impact. She staggered backward, one hand gripping the rough wooden table for support, while the other pressed against her chest, as if she could somehow keep her heart from shattering completely. You're talking about buying me, like cattle, like property to be bartered and sold." "It ain't like that, Evie," Jeremiah said quickly, but he couldn't meet her eyes, couldn't face the accusation and hurt he saw there. "You'd be better off with him. He's got gold, lots of it, and the children. The children will be safer if their mother is gone." Evangeline's voice rose to nearly a shout, years of suppressed frustration and anger finally boiling over. "If they grow up knowing their father sold their mama like she was a side of beef, like she was nothing more than a commodity to be traded?" "Mama." Sarah's small voice was thick with tears, her 8-year-old mind trying to process the adult horror that was unfolding around her. "What's happening? Why are you shouting?" Evangeline knelt down immediately, pulling both children into her arms, breathing in their sweet scent and trying to memorize the feeling of their small bodies pressed against hers. Over their heads, she glared at her husband with a fury that could have melted steel, with a rage born of betrayal and desperation, and the fierce protective instinct of a mother whose cubs were being threatened. 8 years, Jeremiah," she said, her voice low and dangerous. 8 years I've stood by you, followed you to this God-forsaken place when you said we'd build a better life. 8 years I've raised your children, kept your house, warmed your bed, supported your dreams even when they seemed impossible. I've never complained about the isolation, the hardship, the loneliness. And this is how you repay me? This is how little I mean to you? The Carlisle gang will kill us all if I don't pay up by Friday, Jeremiah said desperately, running his hands through his thinning hair. They ain't the kind of men who give second chances, Evie. At least this way, you live. The kids live. There's hope for a future. And what about them? Evangeline gestured to Tommy and Sarah, who were clinging to her with increasing desperation as they began to understand that something terrible was happening. What happens to our children when I'm gone? Who's going to read them stories and tend their scrapes and teach them right from wrong? For the first time, Marcus spoke again, his deep voice cutting through the emotional chaos with calm authority. They'll be cared for. I give you my word on that, Mrs. Whitmore. The word of a savage who buys women like livestock? Evangeline spat, her voice dripping with contempt and fear. Forgive me if I don't find that particularly reassuring. Something flickered in Marcus's blue eyes. Hurt, perhaps, or disappointment, or maybe something deeper that she couldn't quite identify. The expression was there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. Mrs. Whitmore, I understand your anger, and I don't blame you for it, but I'm not the villain in this story. Your husband gambled away everything you own, including the deed to this land. The Carlisle gang owns you now, all of you, unless this debt is paid in full. The truth of it settled over Evangeline like a burial shroud, heavy and suffocating and final. She'd suspected Jeremiah's gambling had gotten out of hand over the past months, had seen the signs in his behavior and their dwindling supplies, but she'd never imagined it was this bad. She'd never dreamed he would mortgage their entire lives, their children's future, their very existence for the temporary thrill of cards and dice and the false hope of easy money. She looked at her husband, really looked at him, and saw the hollow-eyed desperation of a man who'd sold his soul piece by piece, and was now trying to sell hers to buy himself just a little more time. His hands shook with withdrawal from alcohol. His face was gaunt with stress and guilt, and his eyes held the wild look of a cornered animal who would do anything to survive. "You have 1 hour to decide," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "After that, I withdraw my offer, and you face the Carlyle gang alone. I've heard what they do to families who can't pay their debts, Mrs. Whitmore. It's not a death you'd want for your children." He turned and walked out of the cabin with measured steps, leaving a family in ruins behind him, leaving Evangeline to contemplate a choice that was no choice at all. The next hour passed in a blur of tears, arguments, and heartbreak that seemed to stretch on forever. Jeremiah pleaded and explained and justified, his words tumbling over each other in his desperation to make her understand why he'd done what he'd done. Tommy and Sarah clung to their mother and cried, their young minds unable to process the adult complexities of debt and danger, but understanding with perfect clarity that their world was ending. And Evangeline felt her entire existence crumbling around her like sand, everything she'd built and worked for and believed in dissolving into nothing. She thought about running, about taking the children and disappearing into the wilderness, but where could they go? They had no money, no supplies, no family to take them in. The desert was unforgiving, and winter was coming. They would die out there, slowly and painfully, and their deaths would accomplish nothing except leaving Jeremiah to face his fate alone. She thought about fighting, about refusing to go and forcing Marcus and the Carlyle gang to take them by violence. But what would that accomplish except ensuring that her children witnessed their mother's rape and murder? At least this way, there was a chance they might survive, might grow up and have lives of their own. In the end, she made the only choice she could. She couldn't let her children be hurt because of their father's mistakes, even if it meant sacrificing herself on the altar of his stupidity and weakness. "I'll go with you," she told Marcus when he returned exactly 1 hour later, his face grave and his eyes filled with what might have been sympathy. "But I have conditions." "Name them." "The children stay together always. They're not to be separated under any circumstances. And if anything happens to me, you make sure they know. You make sure they know I love them more than life itself, more than my own safety, more than anything in this world." Marcus nodded solemnly, and she could see something like respect in his expression. "You have my word, Mrs. Whitmore. On my honor, you have my word." The next few minutes were the worst of Evangeline's life, worse than the pain of childbirth, worse than the death of her parents, worse than any physical agony she'd ever endured. Packing a small bag while her children sobbed and begged her not to leave, kissing their sweet faces one last time, and trying to memorize every freckle and dimple, promising them she'd find a way back to them somehow, even though she had no idea if such a thing would ever be possible. "Don't leave us, Mama," Sarah wailed, wrapping her small arms around Evangeline's legs with desperate strength. "Please don't go. We'll be good. We promise we'll be good." "I have to, sweetheart," Evangeline whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks in rivers of salt and sorrow. "But I promise you, I promise, this isn't the end of our story. Somehow, some way, Mama will come back to you." Tommy, trying to be brave like he thought a man should be, stood straight and tall despite the tears that tracked down his dirty cheeks. "Will you come back for us, Mama? Really and truly? You be brave and take care of your sister, and remember that Mama loves you both more than all the stars in the sky." Marcus waited by the door with surprising patience, and Evangeline was shocked to see something like compassion in his eyes when she finally turned to face him. When she was ready as anyone could be for such a thing, he offered her his arm like a gentleman escorting a lady to dinner, rather than a purchased woman being taken to an unknown fate. "Are you ready, Mrs. Whitmore?" Evangeline took one last look at her children, memorizing their faces and their voices and the way the afternoon light fell across their hair, then placed her hand on his arm with as much dignity as she could muster. "Lead the way." As they walked away from the cabin, Evangeline heard her children's cries echoing off the canyon walls like the sound of her own heart breaking. Each sob felt like a knife twisting in her chest, but she kept her head high and her steps steady. Whatever lay ahead, whatever this mountain man intended to do with her, she would face it with dignity and courage. She was a mother, and mothers did whatever they had to do to protect their children, even if it meant walking into hell itself. Marcus led her to two horses, a large black stallion that looked as wild and dangerous as its master, and a gentler brown mare with kind eyes and a patient demeanor. He helped her mount with surprising courtesy, his hands respectful, and his manner that of a gentleman despite his fearsome appearance, then swung up onto his own horse with practiced ease. "Where are you taking me?" she asked as they began riding up a narrow mountain path that seemed to lead directly into the heart of the wilderness. "Home," he replied simply, and something in his voice made her look at him more closely. They rode in silence for nearly an hour, climbing higher and higher into the red rock formations that dominated the Arizona landscape like ancient monuments to gods long forgotten. The path was treacherous, winding between boulders and along narrow ledges that dropped away into seemingly bottomless canyons. Evangeline had never been this high in the mountains before, and despite her fear and grief, she couldn't help but be awed by the wild beauty of the landscape. Finally, Marcus turned his horse toward what looked like solid rock, but as they drew closer, Evangeline could see it was actually a cleverly concealed cave entrance, hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines and carefully arranged stones. The opening was large enough for the horses to pass through comfortably, suggesting that this was a well-established route rather than a casual shelter. "Welcome to my domain," Marcus said, dismounting and helping her down from her horse with the same courteous manner he'd shown throughout their journey. Evangeline expected to find herself in a dank, primitive cave, filled with animal bones and crude weapons, perhaps a fire pit and some scattered furs for sleeping. Instead, she gasped in amazement as she followed Marcus through a natural archway into what could only be described as an underground mansion that defied all logic and expectation. The main chamber was enormous, easily the size of a large house, with natural skylights carved through the rock ceiling that allowed golden sunlight to filter down and illuminate the space with warm, dancing light. Rich Persian carpets covered the smooth stone floor, and the walls were lined with books, artwork, and what looked like very expensive furniture that wouldn't have been out of place in the finest homes back east. A fire crackled cheerfully in a natural fireplace that had been expertly modified with proper ventilation, and she could see doorways leading to other rooms that suggested this underground home was far more extensive than what she could see. This is incredible," she breathed, turning slowly to take in every impossible detail. "How is this possible?" Marcus shrugged off his animal pelts with practiced movements, revealing well-tailored clothes underneath that spoke of wealth and refinement. Without the wild furs and with his hair pulled back properly, he looked like what he truly was. A cultured, educated man who could have walked comfortably through the drawing rooms of San Francisco or New York. "Welcome to my real home," he said, hanging the pelts on wooden pegs that had been driven into the stone walls. "The caveman persona is just a disguise I wear when I venture into the outside world." Evangeline stared at him in amazement, her mind reeling as she tried to reconcile this elegant underground mansion with the savage mountain man she'd thought he was. But why? Why live like this, pretending to be something you're not? Why hide away from civilization when you clearly have the means to live anywhere you choose? Marcus's expression darkened, and for a moment, the pain in his eyes was so raw and naked that Evangeline had to look away. Because sometimes the only way to catch monsters is to become invisible to them. Sometimes the only way to get justice is to make people believe you're not worth their attention. Before Evangeline could ask what he meant, something caught her eye. On a small table near the fireplace sat a framed photograph, a beautiful woman with kind eyes and gentle smile, standing beside a small girl who couldn't have been more than 5 years old. The child had the same blue eyes as Marcus, and the family resemblance was unmistakable. Both were dressed in fine clothes, and the formal pose suggested this was a professional portrait taken by someone of considerable skill. "Your family?" she asked softly, approaching the photograph with careful steps. Marcus followed her gaze, and his entire demeanor changed like clouds passing over the sun. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment, he looked every one of his 40-odd years, and more besides. The weight of grief settled over him like a visible burden. My wife Catherine and daughter Emma, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. They died 3 years ago. I'm sorry for your loss, Evangeline said, and meant it. Whatever else this man might be, whatever he might want from her, the pain in his voice when he spoke of his family was genuine and devastating. They were murdered, Marcus continued, his voice growing harder, colder, filled with a rage that had been burning for 3 long years. Burned alive in our house in Tucson while I was away on business, negotiating a mining contract that would have made us wealthy beyond imagining. When I came home, he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, but Evangeline could imagine all too well what he must have found. Her heart clenched with sympathy for this man, who had lost everything that mattered to him. Oh, Marcus, I'm so very sorry. No one should have to endure such a loss. The men who killed them wanted my mine, the richest silver vein in the territory, worth more money than most people see in a lifetime. They thought if they eliminated my family, I'd be too grief-stricken to fight them for it, too broken to stand in their way. Marcus turned to face her, and the pain in his eyes was almost too much to bear, mixed with a determination that burned like cold fire. They were right about the grief, but they underestimated my desire for justice. Is that why you live up here? You're hunting them? I've been watching them for 3 years, learning their habits, their weaknesses, their routines, documenting their crimes, gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to strike. His voice was steady now, controlled, but Evangeline could hear the steel beneath it. The Carlisle gang, the same men your husband owes money to, they're the ones who killed my family. Evangeline's blood ran cold, and she sank into one of the elegant chairs as the full implications hit her. The same men who threatened us? Who would have hurt my children? Marcus nodded grimly. When I heard that Jeremiah owed them money, when I saw how they were circling your family like vultures waiting for something to die, I knew I had to act. I couldn't let them destroy another family the way they destroyed mine. The truth hit Evangeline like a thunderbolt, reshaping everything she thought she knew about this situation. You didn't buy me. You saved me. I saved all of you, Marcus confirmed. Or at least I'm trying to. Your husband's debts are paid, but those men won't give up easily. They'll use any leverage they can find, and families are always the best leverage of all. Evangeline sat in stunned silence, overwhelmed by everything she'd learned. The man she'd thought was a savage mountain man was actually an educated gentleman seeking justice for his murdered family. The transaction she'd thought was her being sold into slavery was actually a rescue mission. Everything she'd believed about her situation had been turned upside down in a matter of minutes. My children, are they truly safe? For now, but not for long. Marcus knelt beside her chair, his blue eyes intense and serious. Evangeline, I need your help. Not as a servant or property, but as a partner. Those men have to be stopped, and I can't do it alone. What are you asking me to do? Help me bring them down. Help me get justice for my family, and save yours in the process. Evangeline looked around the beautiful cave dwelling, then back at the photograph of Marcus's murdered wife and daughter. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, she felt something other than despair coursing through her veins. She felt purpose, determination, and the fierce desire to strike back at the men who preyed on innocent families. What do you need me to do? Over the next several days, Evangeline learned the full scope of Marcus's operation, and she was astounded by the complexity and thoroughness of his planning. The wild mountain man persona was just one of several identities he'd cultivated over the past 3 years. In town, he was known as Michael Carrington, a wealthy investor from back east with interests in mining and land speculation. Among the criminal element, he was simply the buyer, a mysterious figure who purchased stolen goods with no questions asked and paid better prices than anyone else. Each identity was carefully crafted and maintained, with appropriate clothing, mannerisms, and background stories that had been tested and refined through months of careful use. The key to catching criminals, Marcus explained as they sat around his fireplace on her 3rd night in the cave, sharing a dinner that would have been at home in the finest restaurants, is to become indispensable to them. They trust me because I've never betrayed them, never asked too many questions, never tried to cheat them or shortchange them. They have no idea they're feeding information to their greatest enemy. Evangeline had been transformed as well, both physically and mentally. Marcus had provided her with beautiful clothes that actually fit her properly, not the hand-me-downs and makeshift alterations she'd grown accustomed to, but garments that had been tailored specifically for her figure. For the first time in years, she felt attractive, desirable, worthy of admiration. The constant worry about her children remained, of course, a dull ache that never quite left her chest, but it was tempered now by hope and determination and the growing certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be. "Tell me about the plan," she said, setting down her teacup and leaning forward with interest. "How do we bring down the Carlisle gang?" Marcus spread a detailed map across the polished coffee table, and Evangeline could see that it had been annotated extensively with notes, sketches, and markings that spoke of months of careful observation. "The Carlisle gang operates out of a compound about 20 miles south of here. They've got legitimate businesses, a cattle ranch, a freight company, even a small bank. But their real money comes from robbery, extortion, and murder for hire. How many men are we talking about?" 12 regulars plus whatever hired guns they bring in for special jobs. Could be as many as 20 at any given time. Marcus pointed to various locations on the map. "The leader is Bull Carlisle, and he's as mean and vicious as his name suggests. His lieutenant is a man called Snake Morrison, and he's the one who actually planned and executed the attack on my family." Evangeline studied the map carefully, noting the various marks and annotations Marcus had made over the months of surveillance. "What's our objective? Just killing them outright?" "Justice, not revenge," Marcus corrected firmly. "I want them arrested, tried, and hanged legally according to the law of the land. But first, we need evidence of their crimes, evidence that will hold up in court and convince a jury of their guilt. And how do we get that evidence?" Marcus smiled, and for the first time since she'd known him, it wasn't a sad smile weighted down by grief and loss. "That's where you come in. They've never seen you before, have no reason to suspect you of any connection to me or anyone else they've wronged. With the right story, the right disguise, you could get close to them in ways I never could." "What kind of disguise?" "A widow looking to invest her late husband's money in legitimate business opportunities. You'd be wealthy, refined, and very interested in what they have to offer." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying her with an appraising eye. "You have the bearing for it, the intelligence, the natural grace. With the right clothes and preparation, you could pass for high society without any trouble at all." Evangeline considered this carefully. It was dangerous, incredibly dangerous, but it might work. The Carlisle gang would never suspect a grieving widow of being a threat to their operations. "What about my children while we're doing this?" "I won't do anything that puts them at greater risk." Marcus's expression grew serious and troubled. "That's the other problem we need to solve, and it's more urgent than I initially thought. I've been watching your husband since you've been here, and he's not handling your absence well. The drinking has gotten worse, much worse, and he's not taking proper care of Tommy and Sarah." Evangeline's heart clenched with fear and maternal instinct. "Are they all right? Are they eating properly? Are they clean and safe?" "They're safe for now, but they're not thriving. They ask about you constantly, and Jeremiah doesn't know how to answer them. He's drinking himself into a stupor most nights and leaving them to fend for themselves during the day." Marcus hesitated, clearly reluctant to share what he'd learned. I think Jeremiah is planning to send them away." "Send them where?" Evangeline shot to her feet so quickly that her chair nearly tipped over, panic flooding through her system like ice water in her veins. "There's a wealthy family in Phoenix, the Hendersons. They've been looking to adopt children for years, specifically twins if possible. Jeremiah has been corresponding with them, and from what I can tell, he's seriously considering their offer." "He's going to sell my babies?" The words came out as a growl, low and dangerous and filled with a mother's fury. "He's going to sell my children to strangers?" "I don't think he sees it that way. I think he genuinely believes they'd be better off with a family that can provide for them properly, give them education and opportunities he never could." Marcus stood as well, ready to restrain her if necessary. "But the result would be the same. Your children would be gone, possibly forever." Evangeline began pacing the cave like a caged lioness, her hands clenched into fists and her mind racing with desperate plans. "Over my dead body. Those are my children, my babies. I carried them in my womb. I brought them into this world. I've raised them and loved them and protected them. No one is taking them from me. Not Jeremiah. Not some rich family in Phoenix, not anyone. Which is why we need to act quickly, Marcus said calmly, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of her emotions. If we can expose the Carlisle gang and clear your husband's debts completely, you can go back to your children. But if we wait too long, if the Henderson family takes them before we can act, they'll be gone, Evangeline finished, her voice hollow with despair and terror. They'll be lost to me forever, and I'll never see them again. Marcus crossed the room and placed gentle hands on her shoulders, his touch warm and reassuring and solid. We won't let that happen. I promise you, Evangeline, we will get your children back, and we will make sure they never have to fear being separated from you again. Looking up into his eyes, Evangeline felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Trust. Real, complete trust in another human being. The kind of faith that allowed you to place your life and the lives of your children in someone else's hands without reservation. When do we start? She asked. The next morning, Marcus began Evangeline's transformation in earnest, and she discovered that he was apparently quite skilled with disguises and had an extensive wardrobe of costumes for his various identities. The process took several hours, but by the time he was finished with her, Evangeline barely recognized herself in the mirror, and the change was nothing short of miraculous. Her brown hair had been transformed into an elegant auburn through the careful application of various dyes and treatments, and it was now styled in the latest fashion, with sophisticated curls and waves that spoke of expensive salon work. A cleverly applied corset and bustle made her appear slimmer, while still maintaining the matronly respectability that would be expected of a widow, and the dress itself was expensive black silk with jet beading that caught the light beautifully. Makeup had been applied with a subtle hand, just enough to enhance her natural features without appearing garish or inappropriate for a woman in mourning. Mrs. Victoria Ashford, Marcus announced with obvious pride, presenting her to herself in a full-length mirror that had been positioned to catch the best light. Recently widowed, inherited her husband's shipping fortune, looking to diversify her investments in the growing Arizona territory. Evangeline stared at her reflection in amazement, hardly able to believe that the sophisticated, attractive woman looking back at her was really herself. The transformation was complete and utterly convincing. She looked every inch the wealthy widow she was supposed to be portraying. I look beautiful, Marcus finished softly, his voice carrying a warmth that made her pulse quicken. You look absolutely beautiful. Their eyes met in the mirror, and Evangeline felt a flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with nerves about their mission, and everything to do with the way this man was looking at her. When was the last time a man had called her beautiful and meant it? When was the last time she'd felt desirable, worthy of admiration, attractive in her own right rather than merely tolerated? We should practice your story, Marcus said, stepping back and becoming businesslike again, though she could see the effort it cost him to break the spell that had been building between them. Victoria Ashford, where are you from originally? San Francisco, Evangeline replied, falling into character with surprising ease. My late husband Harold made his fortune in shipping, starting with a single vessel and building it into a fleet that operated throughout the Pacific. I'm looking to invest in land and cattle in Arizona territory because I believe the railroad expansion will create significant opportunities for growth and profit. Why Arizona specifically? Why not stay in California where you have established connections? Too many memories, she said with just the right note of melancholy in her voice. Harold and I built our life together in San Francisco, and everywhere I look, I see reminders of what I've lost. I need a fresh start somewhere new, somewhere I can build something that's entirely my own. They practiced for hours, with Marcus playing various roles, potential business partners, suspicious locals, even members of the Carlisle gang themselves. He was a skilled actor, able to shift his voice and mannerisms to create entirely different characters, and he pushed her hard to make sure her performance would be flawless under pressure. By evening, Evangeline felt confident in her ability to maintain the deception, even under intense scrutiny. There's one more thing, Marcus said as they prepared for bed, both exhausted from the day's preparations. He had, with perfect gentlemanly courtesy, given her the master bedroom while he slept in a smaller chamber, never once making her feel uncomfortable or pressured despite the intimate nature of their living arrangement. If anything goes wrong, if you're in danger, you get out immediately. Don't try to be a hero. Don't worry about the mission. Just get yourself to safety. What about the evidence we need? What about bringing them to justice? Evidence isn't worth your life, Marcus said firmly, his blue eyes intense with concern and something deeper. Promise me, Evangeline. Promise me you'll prioritize your safety above everything else. She nodded, touched by his concern and the obvious sincerity of his feelings. I promise. But as she lay in the comfortable bed that night, staring up at the stone ceiling and listening to the distant sounds of the wilderness outside, Evangeline made a different promise to herself. She would do whatever it took to bring down the men who had threatened her family and murdered Marcus's. She would get the evidence they needed. She would see justice done, and she would get her children back, no matter the cost to herself. The next morning, they rode into the town of Dry Creek, where the Carlisle gang was known to conduct some of their legitimate business and maintain their public facade of respectability. Evangeline, as Mrs. Victoria Ashford, took a room at the finest hotel in town and began making inquiries about investment opportunities with the careful precision of a woman who had money to spend and the intelligence to spend it wisely. The hotel was the grandest establishment Dry Creek had to offer, though by Eastern standards, it would have been considered modest at best. Still, it served their purposes perfectly. It was the kind of place where wealthy investors would stay, where business deals were discussed over brandy and cigars, where a widow with money would naturally gravitate. Evangeline played her part to perfection, treating the staff with polite courtesy, while making it clear through subtle gestures and generous tips that money was no object. It didn't take long for word to reach the right ears. The frontier was a place where news traveled fast, especially news about wealthy newcomers with investment capital. By the second day, she was approached by a well-dressed man who introduced himself as William Carlisle, Bull's younger brother, and the carefully crafted public face of their criminal organization. Mrs. Ashford, he said, removing his hat politely and offering a smile that was practiced and charming. I understand you're looking to invest in our growing territory. Indeed I am, Mr. Carlisle, Evangeline replied with exactly the right mixture of interest and caution. I've heard wonderful things about the opportunities here, though I must confess I'm being very selective about my investments. A woman alone must be particularly careful with her resources. Of course. A wise approach. William's eyes appraised her in a way that made her skin crawl, but she maintained her composure. Perhaps you'd join me for dinner this evening. I'd be happy to discuss some ventures that might interest a lady of your refined tastes and considerable resources. I would be delighted, Evangeline replied graciously, though inwardly she was already calculating risks and planning escape routes. That evening, dining in the hotel's restaurant under the warm glow of oil lamps and surrounded by the low murmur of other conversations, Evangeline played her part perfectly. She was interested but not eager, wealthy but not foolish, charming but not flirtatious. She asked intelligent questions about cattle ranching, mining operations, and land speculation while carefully probing for information about the Carlisle organization's various enterprises. William Carlisle was clearly smitten, and she could see him mentally calculating not just her investment potential, but her personal appeal as well. The thought made her stomach turn, but she smiled and nodded and played the role of the lonely widow who might be persuaded to invest in more than just business opportunities. We have a lovely cattle ranch about 20 miles south of here, he said over dessert, his voice taking on a more intimate tone. Perhaps you'd like to see it tomorrow. My brother Bull runs the day-to-day operations, and I know he'd be fascinated to meet such an accomplished businesswoman. That sounds wonderful, Evangeline replied, her pulse quickening with excitement and terror. This was it, her chance to get inside the compound, to see their operation firsthand, to gather the evidence Marcus needed. As she prepared for bed that night, Evangeline felt a mixture of anticipation and dread that made sleep nearly impossible. Tomorrow, she would come face to face with the men who had destroyed Marcus's family and threatened her own. She would smile at them, charm them, and hopefully find what they needed to bring them to justice. But first, She had to survive the encounter. The ride to the Carlisle ranch the next morning was both beautiful and ominous. The Arizona landscape stretched out around them in all its wild glory. Red rocks and endless sky, scattered pine trees and vast expanses of desert that seemed to go on forever. Under other circumstances, Evangeline might have enjoyed the journey, but knowing what lay ahead made every mile feel like a step closer to danger. The Carlisle ranch was impressive, she had to admit grudgingly. Sprawling across several hundred acres of prime grazing land, it looked like the picture of respectability and success. Well-maintained buildings, healthy cattle, and the kind of infrastructure that spoke of serious money and long-term planning. But she could see the signs Marcus had taught her to recognize. Too many men for a simple cattle operation. Too many guns visible for peaceful ranching. Too much tension in the air for a legitimate business. Bull Carlisle was exactly what his name suggested. A massive man with the temperament of an angry beast, barely held in check by the thin veneer of civilization. He stood easily 6.5 feet tall, with massive shoulders and hands that looked like they could crush a man's skull without effort. But he was also cunning, and Evangeline could see him evaluating her carefully as William made the introductions, his small eyes taking in every detail of her appearance and manner. "Mrs. Ashford," Bull said, his voice like gravel being ground under wagon wheels. "My brother tells me you're looking to invest in our little territory." "I am indeed, Mr. Carlisle," Evangeline replied smoothly. "I find the frontier spirit quite invigorating, and I believe there are significant opportunities for those with the vision to see them." They spent the morning touring the ranch, with William playing the gracious host, and Bull watching everything with suspicious eyes that never seemed to miss a detail. Evangeline played her part perfectly, asking intelligent questions about cattle breeding and land management, while secretly noting the layout of the compound, the number of armed men, and the various buildings that might contain the evidence they needed. She counted at least 15 men during the tour, all of them armed and all of them carrying themselves with the alert wariness of professional criminals. The bunkhouse was larger than necessary for legitimate ranch hands, and she could see weapons racks through the windows that contained far more firepower than any cattle operation would ever need. It was during lunch that she saw him, Snake Morrison. She recognized him instantly from Marcus's detailed description, and it took every ounce of her acting ability to keep from reacting. This was the man who had planned the attack that killed Catherine and Emma, who had personally overseen the burning of an innocent woman and child. This monster was sitting at the same table, eating the same food, breathing the same air, and acting like a civilized human being when he was anything but. "Snake here handles our freight operations," Bull explained casually, cutting into his steak with unnecessary violence. "Moves goods all over the territory for folks who need special handling." "What kind of goods?" Evangeline asked with polite interest, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. Snake smiled, and it was like looking at a rattlesnake coiling to strike. His eyes were cold and flat, devoid of any human warmth or empathy. "Oh, all kinds of things, ma'am. Sometimes we transport items that folks prefer to keep private. Discretion is very important in our line of work." The implication was clear, and Evangeline nodded as if she understood perfectly. "Discretion is so important in business, isn't it? I've found that many of the most profitable ventures require a certain amount of flexibility regarding conventional approaches." After lunch, William offered to show her the freight depot, and Evangeline agreed eagerly. This might be her chance to find the evidence Marcus needed, to see the records and documents that would prove the gang's criminal activities. The depot was located in a separate building near the main house, and it was clear that this was where the gang's illegal operations were coordinated. Maps covered the walls, marked with what were obviously robbery targets and escape routes. A large safe in the corner probably contained records of their criminal activities, and she could see correspondence scattered across a desk that likely detailed their various illegal enterprises. "Impressive operation," Evangeline murmured, making mental notes of everything she saw while maintaining her facade of polite interest. "We've worked hard to build all this," William said proudly, gesturing around the room. "Started with nothing but determination and the willingness to take risks that other men wouldn't take. And I imagine some of those risks were quite significant." Evangeline probed carefully. William's expression grew more serious, and she could see a harder edge creeping into his manner. Sometimes you have to eliminate competition to succeed in business, Mrs. Ashford. Not everyone understands that the frontier requires a different approach than the civilized East. Before Evangeline could respond, Bull Carlyle appeared in the doorway, his massive frame filling the opening completely. "William, we need to talk. Now." The brothers stepped outside, but the walls were thin and Evangeline could hear their voices clearly through the wooden planks. "I don't like her," Bull was saying, his voice low and dangerous. "Something doesn't feel right about this whole situation." "You're being paranoid," William replied, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "She's exactly what she appears to be. A wealthy widow looking to invest her money. Rich widows don't usually come out here alone, brother." "Where are her servants? Her companions? Her family advisors? What kind of woman travels hundreds of miles into dangerous territory without proper protection?" Evangeline's blood ran cold as she realized that Bull's suspicions were well-founded and potentially deadly, if he decided to act on them. "Maybe we should test her commitment," Bull continued. "See how she reacts to our special freight operations." "What are you suggesting?" "We've got that job planned for tomorrow night. The bank in Prescott. If she's really one of us, she won't have a problem with it. If she's not..." The threat hung in the air, unspoken but perfectly clear. Evangeline had heard enough. She moved casually around the room, pretending to examine the maps while actually memorizing as much detail as possible. When the brothers returned, she was standing innocently by the window, apparently admiring the view. "I should be getting back to town," she said pleasantly. "Thank you so much for your hospitality. This has been most enlightening." "Of course," William said, but there was something different in his manner now, something that made her skin crawl with apprehension. "Perhaps we could continue our discussion tomorrow evening? There's a special business opportunity I'd like to discuss with you." "I'd be delighted," Evangeline replied, though her heart was racing with fear and anticipation. The ride back to town felt endless, and Evangeline was acutely aware of the man Bull had assigned to escort her, ostensibly for her protection, but really to watch her and report back on her activities. She maintained her cheerful chatter about the beautiful scenery and the promising investment opportunities until they reached the hotel, then hurried up to her room with as much dignity as she could muster. Marcus was waiting for her, having entered through the window, and the relief on his face when he saw her was palpable. "How did it go?" he asked immediately. "They're planning to rob the bank in Prescott tomorrow night," Evangeline said quickly, keeping her voice low in case there were listeners. "And I think Bull suspects something. They want me to come back tomorrow evening, probably to test my reaction to their criminal activities." Marcus cursed under his breath, his hands clenching into fists. "This is moving faster than I anticipated. We need to get word to the authorities in Prescott, and we need to get you out of here." "No," Evangeline said firmly, surprising them both with the steel in her voice. "This is our chance to get the evidence we need. If I can be there when they plan the robbery, if I can get into that safe in their depot." "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous, and I won't risk your life for evidence we might be able to gather another way." "Marcus, they're going to rob innocent people tomorrow night. They might kill someone, bank clerks, customers, anyone who gets in their way. We have to stop them." She stepped closer to him, her eyes blazing with determination. "Besides, there's something else. I received word this morning that my children, Tommy and Sarah, have been sent to Phoenix to the Henderson family. My babies are gone, Marcus, and every day we delay is another day they're being raised by strangers who think they bought them like livestock." The pain in her voice was raw and real, and Marcus felt his heart break for her all over again. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his blue eyes intense with concern and something deeper, something that made her pulse quicken despite the danger surrounding them. "Evangeline, you mean too much to me to risk losing you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. I won't let anything happen to you." The words hung in the air between them, and suddenly the danger, the mission, everything else faded away. All Evangeline could see were Marcus's eyes, full of concern and protectiveness and something that looked very much like love. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This man, this complicated, damaged, wonderful man, had feelings for her that went far beyond their partnership in seeking justice. "I mean something to you?" she asked softly, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing in his expression. "You mean everything to me," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "More than I thought I could ever feel again after losing Catherine and Emma. You've brought light back into my darkness, hope back into my despair. I can't lose you too." Before either of them could think about the wisdom of it, before they could consider the complications or the danger or the impossibility of their situation, they were in each other's arms. The kiss was desperate and passionate, born of shared danger and mutual respect and the recognition of something precious that had grown between them despite all the obstacles. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and the air between them crackled with electricity and possibility. "This complicates things," Marcus said, though he made no move to step away from her. "Everything about this situation is complicated," Evangeline replied, her hand still resting on his chest where she could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. "But that doesn't mean we abandon the mission. My children are still in danger. Your family still deserves justice, and innocent people are going to be hurt if we don't act." Marcus studied her face for a long moment, taking in the determination and courage and fierce protectiveness that made her so remarkable. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right, but we do this my way with proper backup and safety measures. I'm not risking your life unnecessarily." They spent the rest of the evening planning, their professional partnership now complicated by the emotional bond that had formed between them. Marcus would alert the sheriff in Prescott about the planned robbery, but they would also be there to gather evidence of the gang's other crimes, and hopefully put an end to their reign of terror, once and for all. It was dangerous, incredibly dangerous, but it might be their only chance to get justice for Marcus's family and save Evangeline's children from a life with strangers who had essentially purchased them. The next day passed slowly, with Evangeline maintaining her role as the interested investor, while secretly preparing for what might be the most dangerous night of her life. She reviewed the layout of the Carlisle compound in her mind, memorized the locations of weapons and potential escape routes, and tried to calm her nerves by focusing on the end goal: justice for the innocent and reunion with her children. That evening, as she prepared to return to the ranch for what might be her final performance as Victoria Ashford, Evangeline received devastating news. A telegram had arrived at the hotel, forwarded from her old address, and the words on the paper hit her like physical blows. Her children were gone. Tommy and Sarah had been legally adopted by the Henderson family, and Jeremiah had signed papers relinquishing all parental rights. Her babies were lost to her, possibly forever, and she didn't even know if they understood why their mother had abandoned them. The pain was so intense it nearly drove her to her knees, but it also crystallized her resolve. These men, the Carlisle gang and all their associates, had caused enough suffering. They had destroyed Marcus's family. They had forced her into an impossible situation that led to the loss of her children, and they would continue to destroy innocent lives until someone stopped them. Tonight, she would help Marcus get the justice he sought. And tomorrow, she would find a way to get her children back no matter what it took. The Carlisle ranch looked different in the evening light, more ominous and threatening, as if the approaching darkness was stripping away the facade of respectability to reveal the criminal enterprise beneath. Oil lamps flickered in windows, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with malevolent purpose, and the number of armed men visible had increased significantly since her morning visit. Evangeline arrived precisely on time, her heart hammering against her ribs but her demeanor perfectly controlled. She was Victoria Ashford, wealthy widow and potential investor, and she would play that role to perfection no matter what horrors awaited her inside. "Mrs. Ashford," William greeted her at the door, but there was something different in his manner, a tension, an edge of suspicion that hadn't been there before. "So good of you to join us this evening. Thank you for the invitation," she replied graciously. "I'm very eager to learn more about your special business opportunities." The evening started pleasantly enough, with dinner and conversation about various investment possibilities. But as the night wore on, the true nature of the discussion became increasingly clear. The men around the table, Bull, Snake, William, and several others she didn't recognize, were testing her, probing her reactions, watching for any sign that she wasn't what she claimed to be. "We have a special operation planned for tonight," Bull told her over brandy, his small eyes never leaving her face. "A test of your commitment to our organization and your willingness to be flexible in your business practices." "What kind of test?" Evangeline asked, though she already knew the answer and was steeling herself for what was coming. "We're going to liberate some funds from the bank in Prescott," Snake Morrison said, with a laugh that made her skin crawl. "Funds that are just sitting there in a vault, not doing anyone any good when they could be put to much better use. You want me to participate in a bank robbery?" Evangeline tried to look shocked but intrigued rather than horrified, though the effort cost her considerably. "Not participate directly," William clarified, though his eyes remained cold and calculating. "Just observe. See how we operate, understand the full scope of our business model. If you're going to invest with us, you need to understand all aspects of our organization." Evangeline pretended to consider this carefully, weighing the implications with the kind of calculated assessment a real investor would make. "I suppose that makes sense from a business perspective. When do we leave?" Within the hour, she found herself riding toward Prescott with a group of heavily armed men, her heart pounding with fear and anticipation. Marcus was out there somewhere in the darkness, along with the law enforcement officers he'd contacted. But would they arrive in time? Would they be able to stop the robbery without getting innocent people killed? And would she survive long enough to see justice done? The ride to Prescott took nearly 2 hours, and Evangeline used the time to memorize faces, count weapons, and listen to the casual conversation that revealed details about other crimes the gang had committed. She heard them discussing previous robberies, murders they'd carried out for hire, and the systematic intimidation of local business owners who refused to pay protection money. As they approached the outskirts of Prescott, Bull raised his hand to halt the group. "Morrison, take 3 men and circle around to the back of the bank. William, you and Mrs. Ashford stay with the horses while the rest of us handle the actual business inside." "What if there are complications?" one of the younger men asked nervously. "Then we handle them the way we always do," Bull replied with a cold smile. "Dead men don't cause problems." The casual way he spoke about murder made Evangeline's blood run cold, but she maintained her composure. These were the men who had burned Marcus's wife and daughter alive, who had threatened her own children, who had destroyed countless innocent lives in their pursuit of easy money. Tonight, their reign of terror would end. The bank robbery went wrong from the very beginning, and Evangeline realized that Marcus's plan was working perfectly. As soon as Bull and his men approached the bank building, they were met with a hail of gunfire from deputies who had been hidden inside, waiting for them. "It's a trap!" Snake Morrison shouted, but his warning came too late. 3 of the gang members were down within the first few seconds, and the others were scrambling for cover behind whatever obstacles they could find. In the chaos that followed, Evangeline managed to slip away from William and make her way toward the sheriff's office, where she hoped to find Marcus in safety. The streets of Prescott erupted in gunfire as the trapped gang members fought desperately against overwhelming odds, but it was clear that the law had prepared well for this confrontation. She found Marcus waiting in the sheriff's office, his face grim with satisfaction as the sounds of battle echoed through the town. "It's working," he told her as she burst through the door. "Most of the gang is either dead or captured. Bull Carlisle took a bullet to the shoulder, but he's alive and in custody. Snake Morrison won't be hurting anyone else. He's dead. And the evidence we need? I sent a team to search the ranch compound while they were all here in town. They found documents, records, correspondence that proves their involvement in dozens of crimes, including the murder of my family." Marcus's voice was steady, but she could see the emotion in his eyes. "It's over, Evangeline. They're finished." Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by the crushing weight of her personal loss. "My children are gone, Marcus. The Hendersons have legally adopted them. I may never see Tommy and Sarah again." Marcus's expression softened, and he crossed the room to take her in his arms. "We'll get them back, I promise you. We'll find a way to get them back." "How? They're hundreds of miles away with people who think they bought them fair and square. What court is going to take the word of a woman who abandoned her children against a wealthy, respectable family?" "We'll figure it out," Marcus said firmly. "I have resources, connections, money. We'll hire the best lawyers. We'll find a way to prove that the adoption was fraudulent. We won't give up." But even as he spoke the words, both of them knew how difficult it would be. The Henderson family had acted in good faith, believing they were providing a home for children whose father could no longer care for them. Proving that the adoption had been arranged under false pretenses would be nearly impossible, especially given Jeremiah's voluntary relinquishment of his parental rights. The next morning brought unexpected hope in the form of a telegram that arrived at the sheriff's office. It was from a lawyer in Phoenix who had been investigating the Henderson family on behalf of another client, and what he had discovered changed everything. The Hendersons, it turned out, were not the respectable family they appeared to be. Mr. Henderson had been involved in several questionable business deals, and there were allegations of fraud and embezzlement that were currently under investigation. More importantly, there were questions about their previous adoptions, specifically whether they had been purchasing children from desperate families rather than going through legitimate adoption agencies. "This is our chance," Marcus said, reading the telegram over Evangeline's shoulder. "If we can prove that they have a pattern of buying children illegally, we can challenge the adoption and get Tommy and Sarah back." The journey to Phoenix was the longest of Evangeline's life, every mile stretching endlessly, as she wondered whether she would ever hold her children again. Marcus had hired the best lawyer money could buy, and they had gathered sworn statements from witnesses who could testify about Jeremiah's gambling debts and the circumstances that led to the children being sent away. The confrontation with the Henderson family was tense and emotionally charged, but the evidence was overwhelming. When presented with proof of their illegal activities and the fraudulent circumstances surrounding the adoption, they reluctantly agreed to return Tommy and Sarah rather than face criminal charges. The reunion was everything Evangeline had dreamed of and more. Her children flew into her arms, sobbing with joy and relief, and for several minutes all three of them simply held each other and cried tears of happiness and gratitude. "Mama, we thought you were never coming back," Sarah sobbed, her small arms wrapped around her mother's neck with desperate strength. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away forever." Evangeline repeated the promise she'd made what felt like a lifetime ago. "I will never leave you again, my darlings. Never." Tommy, trying to be brave but unable to stop the tears from flowing, looked over his mother's shoulder at Marcus, who was standing quietly nearby with tears in his own eyes. "Is he our new papa?" Tommy asked with the direct honesty of childhood. Evangeline and Marcus exchanged a look, and she saw the hope and love and desperate longing in his expression. Here was a man who had lost his own family and was being offered the chance to be part of hers, to help heal the wounds that violence and greed had inflicted on all of them. "Would you like him to be?" she asked gently, though her heart was already singing with the possibility. Both children nodded enthusiastically, and Marcus knelt down to their level, his voice gentle and serious. "I would be honored to be your father," he said solemnly, "but only if you'll have me, only if you want me to be part of your family." "Will you teach us to ride horses?" Tommy asked with the practical concerns of an 8-year-old boy. "Will you read us stories at bedtime?" Sarah added, her concerns equally important in their own way. "I'll do anything you want," Marcus promised, and Evangeline could see the sincerity in every line of his face. "I'll love you and protect you, and never let anyone hurt you again." The children seemed satisfied with this answer, and within moments they were chattering excitedly about all the things they would do together as a family. Evangeline watched Marcus with her children, saw how naturally he related to them, how patient and kind he was, and felt her heart overflow with love and gratitude. Over the following months, as the legal proceedings concluded and their love deepened, Marcus formally proposed. 6 months after their reunion, they were married in a beautiful ceremony in Tucson, with Tommy and Sarah serving as ring bearer and flower girl respectively. Evangeline had never been happier. She had her children back, a man who truly loved and respected her, and the satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served. Marcus had used his considerable mining fortune to build them a beautiful house in town, complete with a large garden where the children could play safely, and a library where Evangeline could pursue her love of reading and learning. She had discovered a talent for teaching and had established a small school for local children, finding deep satisfaction in helping other families build better lives for themselves. The Carlisle gang was no more. Bull Carlisle and his surviving associates had been tried, convicted, and sentenced to death for their numerous crimes. Justice had finally been served for Marcus's murdered family, and the territory was safer for everyone without their criminal influence. As for Jeremiah, he had been so consumed by guilt and grief over his actions that he'd signed papers renouncing all claim to his children and disappeared into the desert. Some said he'd died out there in the wilderness. Others claimed he'd made his way to Mexico to start over. Evangeline felt pity for him, but no regret. Some choices couldn't be undone, and he would have to live with the consequences of his decisions for the rest of his life. On their wedding night, as they stood on the balcony of their new home looking out over the Arizona landscape that had brought them together through such dark circumstances, Marcus took Evangeline's hand in his and spoke the words that had been in his heart for months. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "The danger we went through, the pain we both suffered, the terrible choices we had to make?" Evangeline considered the question seriously, thinking about all they had endured together. She remembered the terror of being traded like property, the agony of separation from her children, the constant fear during their mission against the Carlisle gang. She thought about the nightmares that still sometimes woke her in the middle of the night, the scars that would never fully heal, the innocence that had been lost forever. Then she looked at her new husband, heard the laughter of Tommy and Sarah playing in the garden below, felt the deep contentment that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged, and knew her answer with absolute certainty. "Never," she said firmly, turning to face him fully. "Everything we went through, every moment of pain and fear and uncertainty, it all brought us to this moment. How could I regret the path that led us home to each other?" Marcus smiled and pulled her into his arms, his voice rough with emotion when he spoke. "I love you, Mrs. Evangeline Thornton, more than I ever thought it would be possible to love again." "And I love you, my dear husband," she replied, standing on her toes to kiss him softly. "More than I ever dreamed was possible." As they kissed under the brilliant Arizona stars, with their children's laughter drifting up from the garden, and their whole future stretching out before them like an endless horizon of possibility, Evangeline knew that sometimes the most beautiful love stories began with the darkest chapters. She had been traded for animal skins by a desperate husband to a man who appeared to be a savage, but that apparent tragedy had led her to true love, genuine partnership, and a family built on mutual respect and deep affection. As she held her new husband close and listened to their children play below, Evangeline knew that sometimes the most beautiful love stories began with the darkest chapters. Their journey had been difficult, but it had led them home to each other. Evangeline's journey reminds us that sometimes our darkest moments become the doorway to our greatest blessings. At 45, when she felt worthless and forgotten, she discovered not only her own strength but a love deeper than she'd ever imagined possible. Her story teaches us that it's never too late to start over, never too late to find someone who sees our true worth, and never too late to fight for the family we deserve. Life may trade us for what feels like nothing, but sometimes that exchange leads us exactly where we need to be. What moments in your own life seemed like endings but turned out to be new beginnings? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone who needs to hear it today. And if Evangeline's courage touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss these powerful stories of resilience, love, and second chances that prove it's never too late to rewrite your own fairy tale.